Hi, I'm Bill, and this week I thought I'd try that new Donkey Kong game everyone's so excited about. This is Donkey Kong 94, released in 1994 for the Game Boy, and the first game to fully support the Super Game Boy. How does it hold up 30 years later? And with the upcoming remake of Mario vs Donkey Kong, is now a good time to revisit it? What's the best way to revisit it? What even is a Super Game Boy? Welcome to the Retro Sofa review of Donkey Kong 94. Let's go rescue Pauline. This has actually been my go-to game for the last few months on my Funky S. It's a fantastic pick-up-and-play portable game with mostly single-screen, easily digestible stages. It opens with the original Donkey Kong levels, but very quickly it becomes this neat little platform puzzler where you have to grab the key and get it to the door. The controls are nice and simple. No holding B to run, Mario has a set movement speed and a short jump no matter how long you press the A button, just like the original Donkey Kong. And this is also why I can fully recommend it for all you Funky S owners out there. The tight, simple controls are ideal for the keyring. But it's perfectly good on the TV as well. This was the first game developed specifically for the Super Game Boy. You just plug it into your Super Nintendo, plug the game in there, and then you've got your Game Boy games on the big screen. It's pretty neat. It's basically a SNES cartridge with all the Game Boy internals crammed into it, and it's what I'm using to capture footage for this video. Look, I can change the border. In fact, plug in a SNES mouse and I can draw my own. Hooray! I'm an artist! I remember when we were kids we used to play with the Super Game Boy like a weird two-player thing. It actually supported two-player for some Game Boy games such as Killer Instincts, but that's not what I mean. Controller 1 controls the Game Boy game and then player 2 can draw the border, or draw on the game. We used to take it in turn, so one player would play and the other would try to distract player 1 by drawing funny pictures. Childish, yeah, but you can't tell me that doesn't sound like a good time. This was 90s Nintendo going above and beyond with the whimsy in a way that they don't really do so much anymore. It would have been just fine if this cartridge had let us play our Game Boy games unmodified on the TV screen. But we could draw our own borders, make our own colour palettes, and some games, such as Donkey Kong, had colours and borders built in, and could even make use of the Super Nintendo's sound hardware. Here's a side-by-side comparison of Donkey Kong 94 on the Game Boy and on the Super Game Boy. On top of that, the Super Game Boy had special palettes built in for some games that released before it. This was the definitive way to play Metroid 2 Return of Samus, at least until AM2R came out in 2016, and I guess the official remake on the 3DS a year later. A really nice bit of kit, and dirt cheap to get your hands on one, so if you've got a few Game Boy games lying around, Super Game Boy. So what about Donkey Kong 94 itself? It's one of the early examples I can think of where a game really plays with your expectations. It starts like a straight portable remake of the 1981 arcade classic. At first glance, it's just a pretty accurate remake. Then once you've beaten those initial 4 levels, you're off on a completely new platform puzzler adventure through 97 additional stages. There's a lot here, and it's somewhat surprising that they picked this game to be the showcase for what the Super Game Boy could do when it's such a perfect portable game. It saves after every 4 levels, so no problem if your batteries run out. And if you're using a modern emulation device with save states, it's ideal to play a level or two while queuing at the supermarket. There's no reason portable gaming shouldn't be just as normal as looking at your phone in public. And Donkey Kong might be a tricky game, but it's way less frustrating than doom scrolling. Just remember to turn the sound off. Looking at the manual, it seems Mario's got some new moves with this game. This came out 2.5 years before Super Mario 64, so this is the first appearance of the backflip and triple jump. Well, kind of. Starts with a handstand in this one. What's interesting here is this line: Mario cannot use some of these new actions at first, but as he continues along the quest, he will acquire the skills to use them. Nah. I don't know if they ended up changing that for release, but you can totally backflip your way up the first stage of Donkey Kong if you want to, and doing so is incredibly satisfying, if a bit broken. That said though, at the start of the manual it says, "Please read this instruction booklet thoroughly to ensure maximum enjoyment of your new game," and I don't know. I think there's a lot to be said for giving this to someone who played Donkey Kong in the arcades and watching their eyes light up after the first 4 stages. That won't work on you, obviously. I've already spoiled the whole thing, but try it on a friend. All of the puzzle levels are exceptionally well designed, and there are plenty of stages, particularly boss stages, that focus more on the platforming action as well. For a Game Boy game, it's got a good amount of variety. It slowly introduces new mechanics with these little animations after boss battles, so it's very approachable, even if you don't have the manual. It's got a nice difficulty ramp, but it never gets punishingly difficult in the way classic games often do. It's got a very modern design in a lot of ways. You can get plenty of lives, and it's always clear when you die what you did wrong, so you can try a different approach. It also has the optional extra challenge of grabbing Pauline's parasol, hat and bag in the levels, rewarding you with a bonus game for more lives that you don't need, but it's still nice. Grabbing these gets really tricky later on, but you can always skip them and go back later. The game lets you replay previous stages from the load screen, which again is fairly modern and nice touch. It's also got no business looking this good. It's a Game Boy game, but look at these backgrounds. You don't see much background detail in Game Boy games, given they have exactly 4 colours to work with. Somehow they've done it. The bold sprites show up really well, even on the original Game Boy screen. The cartoony paw screen and intro look great as well. Music's great. Nintendo managed to do so much with so little when it came to the presentation of this game. I'd put it right alongside Link's Awakening as one of the best looking, best sounding, and best playing games on the Game Boy. At its heart, it's still Donkey Kong, particularly in the way Mario moves, including fall damage. You can really fling yourself around with a backflip, but miss the platform and Mario's landing on his head, so you've got to be deliberate and precise with your movements. Thankfully, the controls are buttery smooth, and there's no momentum to worry about either. It controls really well. The enemies ramp up the challenge a fair bit. Most of them you can stand on top of them, pick them up and fling them around like in Mario 2. But not all of them, and some of them really make you think about your approach. There's plenty of variety in the enemies, the obstacles, and also in the levels. Fling yourself off power lines in the big city, get blown around on the wings of an aeroplane, climb vines in the jungle, and use these little fire guys to burn ice blocks on the iceberg. It's all here. Some of it's classic Mario, of course, but the game's also doing its own thing. When the game's at its best, though, is when it's paying homage to the games that came before it, Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr. My first Nintendo console was the Donkey Kong Jr. Game & Watch, so I've always had a soft spot for the young ape. Some levels in this game are straight out of DK Jr., and the lad himself shows up in later levels to help his daddy ruin your day. Additionally, many of the boss levels return to the original concept of Donkey Kong, dodging obstacles and scaling the level to reach DK and Pauline at the top. Wikipedia editors say this game is loosely based on Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr., but they fully misunderstood what this game is and why it's great. A new game in the Donkey Kong series, adding a lot to the formula but staying firmly rooted in its past and in its identity. In fact, I'd say Donkey Kong 94 is to Donkey Kong as Super Mario Bros. 3 is to Super Mario Bros. You know, the more I talk about this game, the more I think it's actually kind of underrated. Honestly, you've got another week before Mario vs. Donkey Kong comes out on Switch, right? Go find Donkey Kong 94 and play it. It's nearly 30 years since its release, and it's still one of the best games Nintendo has ever made. You don't even need to look at it in the context of when it came out, like a lot of other retro games. It's just great and timeless. It was on the 3DS Virtual Console, but that's shut down, and it hasn't made it onto the Switch at the time of recording. Go emulate it on something, and then be ready to buy it as soon as Nintendo wants to sell it to you, because it's well worth it. Anyway, that's my opinion in 2024. Let's take a look at what the gaming press thought of it at the time. This came out just as Donkey Kong Country was being previewed at CES, so the magazines were all about Donkey Kong in August 1994. Nintendo Magazine System issue 23 gave it their seal of quality, of course, and a 94 overall. They described it as fun, really fun, like a whole cart dedicated to the kind of problems presented in the Star Road of Super Mario World, squeezed into a portable machine, made more spectacular through this cool new Super Game Boy hardware. One of the downsides they list is you can't stop playing it, and under lastability, they've said, expect to see Donkey Kong 94 mentioned in years to come as one of the all-time greats. Well, here we are 30 years later, proving them right. The unofficial Nintendo magazine, Total, weren't quite as excited about it, but Frank still gave it a 92% and called it one of the best platform games ever made. He also called Shigeru Miyamoto a top bloke and a godlike genius, but also he keeps calling Pauline Daisy, as a Marilyn Monroe reference I don't get. I don't really get this line at the start either. Does Frank expose himself if I call him a donkey? This comment under a screenshot of the save file screen makes no sense either. Look, I don't normally review reviews, but I feel like this one wasn't really a highlight in Frank O'Connor's career. To be fair to him though, he did have a lot of highlights. He moved to Seattle and joined Bungie, before becoming the franchise director of Halo at 343 Industries. 343 Industries? 343i? I don't know, I'm not a Halo guy. But that's pretty good. So if you know Frank O'Connor at all, you probably know him from Halo. I don't really know Halo, so I mostly know him for his work on 90s British Nintendo magazines. Anyway, Frank, if you're out there, hope you're doing well, but maybe if you get a chance, just pick up Donkey Kong 94 again, give it another go, maybe do another review. You wrote the Halo Reach story, which Kotaku called satisfying, so I know you can do better. I'm going to get Mario vs Donkey Kong on the Switch and I'm sure I'll enjoy it, but if it's like the GBA game, I still prefer Donkey Kong 94. This isn't the first time I've come back to it and it won't be the last. Mario vs Donkey Kong on Game Boy Advance is a fine sequel, and I'm sure the remake will be great, but Donkey Kong 94 was special in a way very few games are. This is one of the rare games that I think everyone has to play at some point, and it's a kick in the pants that Nintendo doesn't seem to want you to. Nintendo does make some of their games available to newer audiences. In fact, every console since the NES, apart from the Game Boy, the Virtual Boy, and the Nintendo 64, has had a version of Super Mario Bros. Seriously. Although to play it on the GameCube you had to unlock it in the Japanese version of Animal Crossing, using one of 30 memory cards which you could have won from Famitsu magazine in 2001. But technically, they did release it. They released it to exactly 30 people, but they did release it. But outside of Super Mario Bros., Nintendo just is not doing a good job of letting people play their older titles, such that there's no first-hand official way to get hold of Donkey Kong 94. It had exactly 2 releases. The original Game Boy cartridge, and the 3DS Virtual Console, which has since shut down. I know, Minerva, it's horrible. No, where are you going to get Donkey Kong 94? Where are you going to get Donkey Kong 94 now? I know. The 3DS eShop shut down, Minerva. It's gone. There's no more 3DS Virtual Console. We'll be okay. We can emulate stuff. We'll be alright. Also, for whatever reason, the 3DS release wasn't in colour. The 3DS was quite capable of doing colour, and the Super Game Boy palette for Donkey Kong was right there, but they just released it in black and white. Probably no 3D either. Never tried it, to be honest. I think it would have been quite good with the 3D. Anyway, in our opinion, Nintendo should have just kept the Virtual Console on the Switch and let you migrate all your purchases over. For now though, emulation is preservation, so get hold of an emulator that supports the Super Game Boy and have a good time. Minerva, you're so little you can play on the Game Boy Micro. The right size for you, isn't it? Play Donkey Kong on the Game Boy Micro. No, because it's not compatible with Game Boy cartridges. That's right, you can't put Game Boy cartridges in the Game Boy Micro. No, you can't. Get a flash card with an emulator. It's really good. Go and buy Mario vs Donkey Kong for the Switch if you haven't already, if only because it will send the message to Nintendo that we want more Donkey Kong, and we want a remake of Donkey Kong 94, and let's just hope that they don't accidentally remake March of the Minis instead. Thanks for joining me on the Retro Sofa. And Minerva.